Different games today. Basically, I think I misdid the schedule last night. I looked at the games from June 15th, I think. And yeah, since I looked at the games from June 15th, I wanted to take a look at the games that were scheduled for last night at June 5th, and the ones that were scheduled for this morning at June 6th. So we're gonna go light on the we're gonna basically go light on the theory discussion today, and look instead at the games that were lined up for last night. So with that said, we can take a look at TK's game. TK's game is first, and here we go. All right, so TK's game. TK is playing white here, and e4, c5, knight f3, b6. Okay, or g6. So this is hyper accelerated dragon. We can look at this, and then the unusual move, the move that's like pretty far down the list in terms of popularity for white here against this dragon is c4. Starting this Maroczy bind early. This is interesting. This puts a high priority on the development of d5. We saw kind of thematically how c4 games involved play in the center and play on the queen side more for white than on the king side. In these games, usually the dragon is pretty kingside attack heavy. So I'm sort of curious to see in terms of this game what happens. Whether white goes with a kingside plan or whether white goes with a center and queenside plan. Bishop to g7, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Overall here, I think basically white is looking fine. I think that there's, this is established opening theory. Still many games out of this. Still 6,400 games out of this. So basically, what happens with the super early Maroczy bind? This pterodactyl defense. Interesting. Let's just see where they define it as the pterodactyl defense. It becomes the pterodactyl defense after this d4, knight takes d4, knight to c6. And then white plays a move that isn't the book move here. So book move here, pretty clearly established, best by over half a point. Bishop to e3. We can see that here. Oh, sorry about that, Kiro. Sorry to hear that. If you'd like to send in some games, please do. But yeah, sorry to hear that you had a difficult tournament. So yeah, knight to d4, knight to c6, bishop to e3 here. So bishop to e3, well better than knight takes c6. With knight takes c6, the eval is about a point, or maybe sorry, it's about equal basically. Knight takes c6, and instead bishop e3, white's about 0.75. Let me take a look. I'm just looking at Kira's comment here. Sounds like is that so? You went 2-1. Is that correct, Kiro, in your tournament? So bishop to e3 over knight takes c6 is the main line here, by the way. Bishop e3, 2-2. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, it sounds like tactical play, doesn't it? Based on what you've said. I mean, if you're missing back rank mates or that kind of thing, that sounds like a tactical. Misstep. They're very common, is the main point, but. Okay, knight to f6, knight to c3, and basically white has the center here. Tactics. If you're trying to improve Otta, definitely tactics. The thing is, you can't charge people for studying tactics, and you can't really help them study tactics too much. What I'd recommend, Otta, if you look at the chess.com Discord. I don't know if you're on the Discord. I'll just send a link to the Discord in case. I think are you on the Discord, Otta? But basically, the best way to improve at a 700 rating is 100% tactics. Anyone definitely so 100% tactics basically. If you're studying tactics at the rating of 700, you can do it using chess.com Puzzle Battle, chess.com Puzzle Rush. Lee Chess has some excellent free resources there too, like Puzzle Storm, Puzzle. Yeah, here, let me send you the link, Otta. Here you go. But yeah, so basically, if you're trying to improve the quickest from where you are, you can do it from you can do it from tactical study in Puzzle Rush, Puzzle Battle, chess, Lee Chess, Puzzle Storm, Lee Chess, Puzzle. I think they call it Puzzle Racer, Chess Tempo. But all of these are just the same thing. They're all basically tactical study. If you study tactics, that is where you can improve the quickest. Sit in front of the tactics trainer for an hour or two a day for a month, and that it will be your quickest route to improve. I'm very confident. Don't basically there's basically no doubt in my mind that that is the quickest way that you can improve out of club level. Chess teachers, I don't know. I mean, so you study tactics using a puzzle battle, or using basically a puzzle trainer. Yeah, so the puzzles basically. If you do puzzles continuously for hours, that will be the quickest way that you can improve. So yeah, Otta, definitely keep at it. Basically, that is the quickest way that you will improve. And yeah, I guess what I would say is don't take it too seriously. The thing about it is, I guess it's not that it can be harder if people are taking things seriously that they shouldn't be taking seriously. But the point is, basically with these kind of puzzle training, you can basically spend an hour or two a day for a month and really improve in a marked way. So yeah, if it's put music on, put television on in the background, and it basically don't take it too seriously. Is my point. It's just for fun. If you're improving out of club level, none of us is going to win a world championship, which is completely fine. It's really just for fun to try to improve. So the point is, work on that, work on puzzle training, and do enough of it. So that's your best way of improving. Otherwise, you're kind of, I just wouldn't do it in a high stress way. Anyways, knight to c3, castles, bishop to e2, and basically white is fine here. Ideas for black can include d6, castles, bishop d7, queen to d2, and basically here, white's going to start exerting pressure on the king side even out of this Maroczy system. So b takes c6, knight to c3, bishop to e2, knight to f6, bishop to e3, castles. And yeah, white can do things like play h4, h5, h6, try to get attacks going on the king side here. Castles, queen a5, rook to c1, rook to b8, b3, rook to d8, and white is fine. F3 provides a better opportunity for white, but rook to d8, f3 is better than so basically this rook to d8 system is basically this system, F3 is slow, is the issue. White has better center control. Basically, white is playing his queen on d1 against queen on d8. Ideas like queen to d2, bishop to f3, rook to d1, these tend to be better options for white, and I think that's a better way to do this. F3 is sort of just slow. You can play knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and white will be about equal. But white basically is fine, and with e5, black provides a lasting target for attack on d6. So basically, white's best plan is to attack on d6 now, and with that, knight to a4, bishop to e6, bishop to d2. White has opportunities to exploit this weak pawn on d6. Has opportunities to exploit this diagonal potentially. And yeah, bishop to c3, knight to d7, and white is fine. No issues. Just just kind of a situation where white is able to exploit weak pawns on the black side. So, anyways, looks good. Bishop a5. Bishop a5 wins a full exchange. Black made a big error in allowing this. Yeah, bishop to a5, bishop takes d8, queen takes d8, and now white is better here. White's up by about 2 pawns. Rook on d1 faces off against d6, and I don't know. I guess I would say here that that things are better for white. Pushing hard against d6 is probably white's best strategic plan, and yeah. This is an unusual move. This looks decisive. Looks like a mouse slip. TK plays rook to d1 here as opposed to rook takes c8. I assume that wasn't intentional, but yeah, just a mouse slip here. Rook takes c8, and things are fine as white. So, anyways, interesting situation. Yeah, let's take a look at where the improvements are. So overall, this line pterodactyl situation or pterodactyl defense, interesting. C4, D4, E4, and against C5, G6, and bishop to G7. Okay. For white, knight takes C6, pawn takes C6, knight to C3, D6. Bishop to E2, and basically strong plays for white. White's going to have lasting advantages on, of threats on D6. But basically here, I think that white is going to have kind of a sustained advantage. This open rook file could be good. But I guess let's go through the moves one by one and see. These are the general characteristics of this opening system. But yeah. So A3 better than rook to C1. I don't know. I wouldn't worry too much about that one. This was a big error by black. And this was the big error by white. So I guess in terms of white's, basically white's biggest error in this game, you've entered the area of tactical play. If f4 is objectively the way to avoid losing your, losing your exchange here, this bishop on h6 is facing off against c1. Instead, f4 and things are pretty much blocked here. Basically bishop on h6 facing off against c1. If just giving black the exchange is a big mistake for white. So between these two moves, so basically, I guess I'm sort of curious about what you would, I guess what you would be interested in here. Bishop to e2, knight to f6, bishop to e3, castles, queen to a5, rook to c1, rook to b8. And basically here, this sentence, bishop to d2, queen to c7, bishop to c3. This is worse for white. Basically, queen to e1 immediately is given by the engine. This is a better way to kind of make the threat on c7 and d8. And white is just better here. I guess the error here again, king to f1. This is not a helpful move. King to f1, facing off against queen to h4. And white is, basically white loses after rook to d1. Honestly, I think I'm going to change my rules here, to be honest. I think I'm going to make it so that anyone who sends a game in has to put a, put a one-sentence explanation of what they're interested in looking at from that game. I think that might be helpful going forward. We're getting a lot of games where it's not super clear what, what people are interested in looking at. So I think I'm going to change that rule. I think I'm going to post that in the Discord. And yeah, everyone will still be able to send games for sure, but I really want to make sure that we're looking at games where people kind of demonstrate the point of what the analysis was supposed to be. I think that's probably helpful. We're just getting kind of a lot where it's not super clear. Anyways, okay, cool. D4. This is Tapa's game. Let's look. D4, D5, C4, pawn takes C4, knight to C3, knight to F6. Okay, cool, interesting. Yeah, all right. So this is basically an early so this is an early pawn takes c4, knight to c3, knight to f6. Basically, this structure should be good for white. Queen's Gambit accepted, usually pretty easy to win back the pawn on c4. So I guess I would take a look at that. e4, e5, d5, b5, knight takes, a6, knight to c3. White's up by about 2 pawns. This looks good for white. And I think here we should be, we should be okay. Queen to a4. So this is a big tactical error, a big miss by black. Playing bishop to b4 here after d5. So far, d5 I think is fine. I think basically d5 or knight to f3. Those are moves that I think will move things forward as white. d5, b5, knight takes. White should be a good amount better after this. b5, knight takes b5, knight takes e4 instead for black. So knight takes e4 is the move for black, and yeah. So d4, d5, c4, pawn takes, knight c3, knight f6, e4, e5, d5, b5. This is actually all fine for black. Black can start advancing on this queen side here because the e4 pawn will hang. Knight takes b5, a6, knight to c3, bishop to b4, queen to a4, checks the king and checks the bishop on b4, so this is overall good. D takes c6, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, and white's up about a piece here. Yeah, so this was a big error for black, and white is in a fine position after this. Cool. Yeah, so white's up. White wins this game. Again, I think this one's pretty straightforward. Just that hung, basically that hung piece on b4. Queen to a4, threatening the king and the bishop, and white is already won. So interesting, interesting game. And yeah, good win for white. Cool. I guess in terms of looking over this opening, this is so Queen's Gambit accepted. Queen's Gambit accepted, knight to c3 is not the most common move. Knight to f3 is the most common move. Knight to f3, e4, e3, and knight to c3. Those are the 4 most common moves here, and white is up a good amount after this. Basically, yeah, this basically these these three moves as white are the most popular. Knight to c3 is well down that list. So knight to c3, knight to f6, e4, e5, e5 here. So yeah, so here I guess I would just say that white is facing off favorably against c4. b5 is playable. Knight takes b5 and knight takes e4 is a line for white. But knight to a6, bishop to b4, queen to a4, forking the king and the bishop on b4. And yeah, everything's fine. So, it's one of these things, basically with the queen or with the knight on c6, you can play pawn takes c6, so that's better. But white is just better here. Pawn takes c6, and yeah. Fine situation, interesting situation, and yeah, d takes c6 as opposed to queen takes c6. I guess that's a little bit of inefficiency, but yeah, overall, this queen threatens on c6, this queen threatens on b4, and after this, white is good. So interesting situation, and yeah, looks like a pretty easily solved opening problem for white. Let's go on to the next one. Thank you for sending the game, Tapas. Okay, this is Spotkins' game. All right. So b6, bishop to f4, e6, bishop to e3, bishop to b7 here. And yeah, so this is basically the English opening, right? I think this is the English defense. Yeah, English defense with this early b6. Knight to f3, f5, knight to e5, g6, c4, bishop to g7. Okay, sure. So looking at this, d4, b6, bishop to f4, e6. Basically, white is playing against a flank opening or playing against a non-aggressive center opening here. E3, bishop to b7, knight to f3, f5. After this, white is solid. White is playing better. English requires c4, right? Yeah, no. So that's the English opening. This is the English defense. Thank you for asking the question, Haroop. But yeah, yeah, it is kind of a basically the English opening is a different thing. So English defense is d4 b6. English opening is c4. That's the difference, and yeah, good to know. Good to know the difference, and but I think that's correct. Basically, facing off this bishop on b7 against g2 is better than this is the demonstration of the main theme in the English defense. English defense, English opening, different things. F5, knight to e5, g6, c4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, d6. And yeah, basically here Black has played kind of a non-aggressive strategy. This is transposed into something that looks somewhat like the French, or sorry, the Dutch. And bishop to b7 is facing off against h1 here. So knight to f6, knight to g5, queen to d7, knight to b5. And basically here, this is an opening that ends up being in a better situation for Black. So knight to a6, this should be better for Black here, and knight to e4 is not tactically correct. So knight to e4, then knight takes e6. This hangs the c7 pawn. So really, again, this game comes down to tactical play. I thought this opening was basically fine. I don't think there's anything too terrible about this for Black. Straightforward Dutch type game out of an English type formation. I think that's fine. D6 maybe slightly inefficient. D6 runs into queen to a4, which is kind of annoying for white to face off against. Queen to a4, c6, sure. But knight to f3, and then basically Black has to decide. So knight f6, basically knight f6, knight to g5, queen to d7, and white's facing off against a basically white is facing off against knights that are attacking aggressively. On knight to a6, this knight is fine, but basically things are running into difficulty here. So knight to e4 is a big difference than, or basically knight to e4 runs into tactical problems after knight takes e6. So this is an opportunity for white. So tactical reasons behind why knight to e4 is not playable. White can play knight takes e6, that followed by knight takes e7. Rook to f8, bishop to d3, and basically Black is fine. E4 is an error. E4 allows a6, pushing the knight back, and then the d4 pawn hangs. So that's big. A6 and then bishop to d4. That is a better way for Black to play this. So yeah, a6 and then bishop takes d4. Knight takes c7, rook takes c7, and here basically Black is fine. Bishop to c4, queen to e5, and yeah, Black should be winning this game. Let's see if it ever gets more equal. The move for a tactical improvement here, after king to h1, bishop to e5, and then rook a d1 traps the queen, I think. Yeah, so rook a d1 refutes this. You need to be kind of careful about this, and unlike the first tactical change, this was actually played in the game. Okay, all right, so that's what happened. 2 tactical misses. I thought the opening was fine for Mikey. I thought everything here was cool. And basically this, this queen to d7 on e6, knight to e4 was a tactical error, leading to knight takes e6. Okay. And then the second one, second issue here was there was a so basically on pawn takes e6, Black is fine. Now Black is really fine. There's no reason to play knight takes c7 there. And the real decisive tactical miss came from bishop to e5, which allows rook a d1, and then this rook facing off on the d file traps the queen. So rook a d1, queen takes b2, and then rook to b1. Best at this point is given as b5 for black. Let's say queen to c3 instead. On queen to c3, basically this whole kind of I guess I would say this whole kind of attack subsides for black. So anyways, it ends up being a draw. It ends up being relatively equal position. White doesn't capitalize on his opportunities, and then after rook takes b6, rook to b8, and it's about equal. So knight to e5, bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, rook takes, and the real decisive, so basically by this point black is up by a lot, and the real decisive move comes with queen to c3, knight takes c3. So anyways, interesting situation. D4, B6, and this all is a this basically all is fine opening play. The real errors come from here come from E4, which hangs D4, and then the second one is was allowing knight takes E6 here potentially after knight to E4. But then things are basically fine for black after this. So interesting situation, better for black, and ultimately black wins after white hangs a queen. So big tactical. I think we've talked about this before, Mikey. I always appreciate you sending in games. But yeah, this overall, overall these tactics, these basically tactics that lead to variations of, or basically I don't know, shifts of 3 to 4 points. That's just too much to be allowing in a game. You really just need to stick with tactical study until better options occur. So, anyways, with that in mind, that is interesting, and I think that offers an improvement for black over white. Basically, if black plays more tactically accurately there, he has better chances to close the game out early, and he has better chances to defend against potential threats like knight takes e6. It's just, I guess I would just say it comes down to tactics at that level. There's not really much there to worry about. Anyways, looking at this, let's take a look. This is another game from TK. We can take a look. All right. So TK is playing black here, and we'll take a look at this. So D4, D5, C4, E6. Interesting. Okay. So basically on this situation, C4, knight to C3, knight to F6. This is interesting. Most common for white here, knight to F3. Second, pawn takes D5. Third, bishop to G5. Okay, so bishop to G5 here. All right. So those are all options for white. Pawn takes, knight to F3, knight to C6. Knight to C6 is unusual here. This does not help black's position. C6 much better than knight to C6 is much better than, or C6 is much better than knight to C6 here, and yeah, this should end up being restrictive to black. You don't want your pawn stuck on C7 here. This isn't helpful. So this knight to C6 move blocking in C7. There are basically no improvements for black. C6 over knight to C7 here is the main point. So C6, bishop to G5, bishop to E7, queen to C2, G6, E3, bishop to F5, bishop to D3, bishop takes, queen takes, and now black is kind of basically the situation is equal. We're in mainline theory, nothing too exciting going on here, and black doesn't have this mangled pawn structure or disrupted pawn on C6, C7. Bishop to G5, bishop to E7, E3. Now we're back into the game. Bishop to F5. This all makes sense. Castling is given as better than bishop to F5 here, but honestly, I think they're about the same. Bishop to F5, basically playing against this open file. That seems like a good idea. Bishop to F5, bishop to B5, castles, knight to E4. So yeah, so basically this knight to e4, this ends up being, basically this ends up being better for black. Knight to e4, bishop to f4, and this bishop's facing off on this c7 pawn. This bishop's facing off on this b1 diagonal. And basically here, black is, black is worse, or black is worse. Bishop to f6 is somewhat inefficient. Instead, better was knight takes c3. But overall here, really, I want to spend more time kind of thinking about this this knight on c6. This knight on c6 does not help black. This is worse. This pawn is stuck on c7, and this pawn is a very important resource in improving the black's position in the queen's gambit. So bishop to e7, e3, bishop to f5, bishop to b5, and here I think white's up by about a pawn. Bishop to f6 isn't exactly right here. Bishop takes c6 is an error, or bishop takes c6 is basically an opportunity for white to improve. And yeah, this ends up being basically bad for black. Better lines: knight takes c3, pawn takes c3. Knight to a5, and black has basically relatively good pieces here. After the game continuation, this bishop is bad for sure on this this diagonal where d4 is going up against it, and knight to c6. Knight to c6 is also kind of a pointless knight move. So. Anyways, that's what I'm thinking. I think overall this was probably this was just not a good middle game continuation. Bishop to f6 in particular is a move that doesn't make a lot of sense. Hey, good morning, Lauren. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So yeah, bishop to f6. This is a this is basically worse for black. Black should not be putting his bishop on a closed file. Playing bishop to f6 onto d4. That's just not something that helps black here. So. Defending this this pawn on d5 is important, but keeping this bishop on a reasonable square is good. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lauren, for asking. Yeah, everything's good. Yeah, yeah, everything's good. Ready to start a new morning. Another interesting morning, and yeah, always fun to see kind of what the new challenges are. So bishop takes c7. So basically this bishop on c7, this weak c7 ended up being a persistent target for black. Better was rook to c8, defending c7, and yeah, cool, Lauren. Yeah, that's awesome. What book is it? Cool. Yeah, thanks. I'll check it out. You were recommending that one. I bet it's a good option. Anyways, it is interesting. I've heard that one's good. I know Agard's a pretty good author, but yeah, interesting stuff. Cool. D4, D5, E6, knight to C3. Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of these things. Like, if we get permission, I would go through it on the stream, but I don't have permission, so unfortunately, I can't do that. Maybe I should reach out to him. I definitely know some people who have who know him, but I don't. So yeah, maybe I should. I would be very interested in going over that material on the stream. But yeah. Knight to f6, d4, pawn takes d4, knight to f3. Yeah, the only issue is, he might be cool with it, but his publisher might not be, so that's always something to think. All the books that I look at on the stream are public domain. They're very old, so yeah, that would be the type of thing that I would have to think about. Yeah, but the thing is, it's probably going to come down to his publisher, who actually owns the copyright, is my understanding. So. Anyways, opens up a whole new question. But the U.S. has a whole bunch of things that they're doing wrong at this point. That's one of them. I don't know. Whatever. I follow the law to the letter. And when yeah. So anyways, yeah. That may I think reaching out to Agard is a good idea, but But yeah, the U.S. is really going in an interesting direction. So bishop to f6, knight to f6. It might qualify for educational exception. It might be yeah, it might qualify for an educational exception, but the copyright thing is just a real pain. Um, so knight takes e4, and basically this knight blocking on c7 is a is an issue. This basically facing off on c7. Rook takes c4, queen takes a2, queen takes b2, and yeah, sad mostly. d4, d5, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, pawn takes, and basically, the situation's about equal. Knight to c6 is the real error, though, for black. Basically, knight to c6 facing off against, or basically clogging this pawn on c6. Knight to c6, bishop to g5. So basically c6 is the main move. Knight to c6 just sort of leads to kind of a sad position. This is basically really weakens the c pawn, which is kind of needed in which is really needed to advance against black in the center. But knight to c6 clogging c7, that's a problem. c6 I assume is the main move. This c6, this is 3,000 games. Bishop to so basically main options for black here in this Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. c6, bishop to b4, bishop to e7, knight b d7, and a6. Yeah, potentially. That's that's true. No, what can you do? It's kind of a bishop to e7, bishop to b4, bishop to e7, knight b d7. But the thing is, it just sort of collapses the kind of black side here. This bishop on c7 is going to become a larger and larger problem, and this bishop to f4 threats on bishop to c7. I guess I understand that. At some level, there is some grounding behind it, but at the same time, you just don't want to make things that are going to destroy. Like basically, this destroy. It's not. I wouldn't say destroys your game, but it really harms your game going forward. Is the point? If the knight plays to c6, the game is just never going to be the same. And eventually, black's going to really, black's going to really suffer as a result of this. So that's the main point I'm saying. Black will never really be able to fully recover because of this. And knight to c6 blocking in c7. It's just never gonna. Black's situation is likely to collapse, and it's likely as a result of inefficient moves like this. Creating these inefficiencies basically is something that black is really going to pay for. If this type of inefficiency is allowed to happen, if c7 ends up blocked in permanently, you're just losing the use of a certain percentage of the board, 100%. That part of the board is not going to be useful to you in any way. And the percentage of the board which is going to become useless is going to become larger and larger as this game continues. Eventually, it's going to lead to your situation collapsing versus things that are, not really that threatening. A3, B4, B5, and it's all just, if white will push on black hard here, and without very good luck, black's situation will conclude with that. So anyways, interesting situation, but don't create inefficiencies for yourself. Creating inefficiency, chess is a game about efficiency, and if you're creating inefficiencies for yourself, like locking in, basically throwing away the c7 pawn, you're really going to pay for it later. So don't, so I would recommend don't do that, but you did it. So anyways, or TK did it. So that's the thing. Fine. If black wants that inefficiency, it's probably going to get larger and larger. Knight to c6 blocks in the c7 pawn. Don't do that. c6, better. Bishop to b4, better. Anyways, knight to c7, blocking in c6, blocking in knight to c6, blocking in c7, and yeah, black is making the least out of his resources here. Yeah, don't blame black when his situation collapses, or don't blame white when black's situation collapses. Bishop to e7, e3, bishop to f5, bishop to b5, castles, bishop takes, and yeah, basically we're sort of in theory here. So yeah, castles, and white is fine. Anyways, here white's up by about a pawn. Fine. Knight to e4, bishop to f4, bishop to f6. The real tactical error for black came in putting his bishop on. So aside from knight to c6, which again I'm gonna really try to talk them out of, but in any case, knight to c6 was played here. Yeah, just blocking the c7 pawn is really a bad idea. Putting this open rook on this open file, creating this inefficiency for no reason. That is just silly. So bishop to e7, bishop to e3, bishop to f5, and white is up by about a pawn here. Yeah, castles, knight to e4, bishop to f4, bishop to f6. This is the error. Yeah, no, it is important. That's what I would say. Definitely, keep an aware. Basically, I can talk about the as an economics student, I can talk about the inefficiencies created by knight to c6 all day. But yeah, it really is foolish. So if you'd like to hear a more credible understanding of why destroying some of your potential resources is bad, look at Tarash's book. Tarash may have a more eloquent way of saying this, but it really is an error, and it really is something that the black ends up paying for. Yeah, no. I mean, it is interesting. I guess what I would say is, yeah, no, in the larger context of this specific game, not a big deal. But if it's happening in this game, I guess it's probably happening in others too. So anyways, that type of efficiency compounds, and it just ends up being a real bad error for black. Anyways, putting the bishop on f6 faces off against d4. And basically, you turn up, you basically put this bishop on f6 facing against d4. This is a real error. So yeah, no. I mean, I completely agree, but what are you gonna do? Anyways, yep. So bishop to f4, really an error, but. Bishop to d6 is an improvement here. So bishop to f6 faces off against d4. This was a mistake, and yeah, this bishop on f6 facing off against this a1 rook leads to a worse position for black. Anyways, bishop to d6 or bishop to f6 facing off against the d4 pawn. This is this is an error. This worsens the black's bishop position. In fact, you're basically taking a move here to place the bishop on worse diagonals than it was on previously. Bishop to d6, much better. Okay, and yeah, basically black is worse after this. Bishop to d6 is a better way to play this. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6. Yeah, fine. Black engine is suggesting knight takes c3 here. Bishop to f6 facing off against d4. Knight e7, knight takes, pawn takes. Bishop takes c7, queen to d5. And now white has a huge advantage. So basically, black ends up paying for that lost pawn on c7, and essentially loses the game because of it. Bummer. So yeah, rook to d8 facing off against d2, pawn takes, bishop to knight to f3, knight to e7, queen to no. I mean, it didn't take that long for that to actualize. I wouldn't expect it any other way. But yeah, anyways, now black has way fewer resources. I think the best move here, queen g6, looks practically forced. He's down a, he's down a, I guess black is technically up in exchange, but losing in terms of the position. Knight takes, bishop to b6, and things are kind of, it's just a very stagnant position. This position ends up being kind of a, yeah, it's just black had so much more here, and but the position just kind of stagnates. Anyways, a lot of this stems from Tarash's position, or what Tarash, or basically what Lauren was talking about, Tarash's position. Don't block your c pawn. Don't do it. Once that happens, this c pawn is pretty much weak for the rest of the game. Bishop to e7, e3, bishop to f5, bishop to b5, castles. Yeah, sure. Knight to e4, bishop f4, bishop to f6 is facing off against this d4 pawn. This was an error. Black still has somewhere close to equality here, although, again, this isn't the most efficient situation. I don't know. But it's up to you. That is, so yeah, anyways, knight to e4, bishop to f4, bishop to f6 facing off against d4. This overall, this position, this ends up being, bishop to d6 is a better way for black to play this. a6 is a better way for black to play this, but bishop to f6 is just a waste of tempo. Anyways, let's look through this situation. Overall, this pawn takes d4, knight takes c6, first error by black. Bishop to f6, second error by black. Knight to e7, third error by black. Yeah, excellent. Very happy to hear that, Amet. Very happy to hear that you were able to improve. That's excellent, Matt. I'm really happy to hear that. I recommend tactical training for everybody. Tactical training, 1 to 2 hours a day on a tactics trainer for a month. I think it will really help almost everybody. Yeah, very happy to hear that you're having good results, Random. The most important thing is that you make a, you basically make a good, basically you aim to maximize on all of, on every opportunity. So I'm really happy to hear all of those positive things, guys. But yeah, 1 to 2 hours a day for, well, I don't know about that. I'm not sure I could take credit for that. But yeah, definitely consider that general idea. You become stagnant is the point. Stagnancy is a very bad thing. If you don't use your resources, if you don't use all of your training resources available to you, you're basically going to end up in a situation where, where basically your resources are going to be allocated poorly. You're going to end up duplicating effort. So anyways, that's my point. Yeah, just go with those puzzles. Just basically keep at it, and I think that'll really help you a lot. 1 to 2 hours a day for a month. Very happy to hear that people are having positive results. I don't know. It's one of those things. It's sort of about incentives. I have no incentive here. My goal is to give free chess lessons to everyone, so I'm just going to give you the advice that I believe to be the most valuable to you. And tactical training, puzzle training gets neglected in a lot of different situations. So anyways, that's just something to think about. I'm glad to hear that people are having positive outcomes. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6. Pawn takes, and basically black is playing exchange. So going front to back on this, knight to c6, first error. Don't block the c6 pawn. Don't know how to say it more articulately or more clearly, but basically blocking the c7 pawn is problematic for black. Bishop to e7, bishop to f5, bishop to b5 here. Castles, knight to e4, bishop to f4, bishop to f6. Second error by black. Basically all these two moves in order. Bishop to f6, knight to e7. I don't know whether they were part of some larger plan, but they were really a big problem for black. Black also can't even quickly enough get defense on a c7 square. This knight plays on this knight takes on e4, bishop takes e4. And basically here, Why is bishop to f6 an error? Great question. Thank you very much for asking it, Ahmet. Really appreciate it. This bishop to f6 facing off against this d4 diagonal. This error is a large one for black. Basically, if black plays bishop to f6 here, this bishop on f6 is blocked. This diagonal is bad. This diagonal, much better for black. Bishop to e7 facing off against h4. Bishop to e7, securing this diagonal. There's a lot of mobility. If this bishop plays here, there's no mobility on the second diagonal. Black has the first diagonal, but the second diagonal gets much worse. So this bishop, you're basically playing a move to stunt your own mobility. That is a mistake. Instead, play something like, I guess I would say here, I don't know, h6 could be good, a6 could be good, but bishop to f6 facing off your bishop into this d4 really worsens your bishop's diagonal. Control of squares is what it's really about. So basically having a bishop where less squares are accessible is bad choice for black. So bishop to f6 facing off against d4, that ends up being bad. Rook to c1, knight to e7, knight takes, pawn takes, and yeah, white's worse after this. Queen to d5, rook to c5, and better options for black include queen takes, knight to d2, queen takes b2, and basically black's up by about 3 pawns here. So, anyways, that was an error for white, yeah, interesting stuff. Or error for black to give up that c7. With bishop to a4, bishop to e6, bishop to b3, queen to a6. Now black is worse off. This actually wasn't completely maximizing on this situation for black. This is a really tactical position. I guess I can end the analysis in terms of when this tactics get started. Did he just hang the bishop? Yeah, let's look. Honestly, I guess I sort of tune out once it starts becoming super tactical. Setting things up is more important. Basically, yes, he did. Yeah, so black hung the bishop. Honestly, I sort of lose interest in this as soon as it starts becoming tactical play. Like, honestly, the engine is what you should be, the tactical play is what the engine is used for. The things that I'm more focused on are the conceptual things, like cut knight c6 out of this game. Knight to c6 is not good. c6, c5, much better for black. Knight to c6 blocks in the c7 pawn and makes sure that this c7 pawn can't get back in the game. So that's that. Second error for black, bishop on e7 facing off against f6. Third error for black, knight to e7 hanging the c7 pawn directly. After this, it turns into a complicated tactical position. I don't know. The engine can do the calculation better than I can. But basically, from a positional perspective, where there still is analysis, knight to c6, first error, blocking the c7 pawn and prevents c6 and c5. Second error, bishop to f6, facing off against d4. This is an error for black's bishop. Third error, knight to e7, directly hangs c7 to knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes c7. So those three errors are where I'm focused on for this game. I think that conceptually, basically knight to c6 is an opening understanding error. Bishop to f6 is a positional error where you're placing the bishop on a worse, a worse diagonal. So there was no good reason to do that. And then knight to e7 was the real error, where knight to e7 basically caused c7 to hang. So, anyways, that's the real question, and that is an interesting game. So yeah, thank you very much for sending it. Thank you very much for the game, TK, as always, and let's take a look at the next one. Next game. All right, this is Matt Yop's game. We'll take a look. So Matt Yop is playing against the Philidor here. Let's just take a look at this game. Where I think we can analyze it. Basically, there's a big shift of about 5 pawns here. After knight to a5 gets played, bishop takes a5 just skews the position towards h5. Hey, welcome, Drumstick. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Appreciate you being here. So yeah, knight to a5, bishop takes h5, bishop to e2, and queen takes, bishop to h6, and white is fine. So yeah, I think the game ends after the knight gets hung. Is there another hung piece here? Let's look at this tactic. Bishop to a5 wins a piece here for black. So basically, multiple piece hanging tactics here. Bishop to a5 facing off against rook to d2. This is a tactical improvement. So definitely consider that. This bishop on a5 facing off against d2. This is better for black there. Bishop to g5, rook to e2, f3, bishop to e6, bishop to f4. Yeah, okay, white wins because black didn't see that tactic. So there's two piece hanging tactics here. With good enough tactics training, you can cut both of these out of your game. First, knight to a5. Knight to h5 is a big error for black. With bishop takes h5, white is up a piece against black, and things are completely fine here. So yeah, queen takes, bishop to h6, bishop takes, and basically this is a situation where white's up in exchange. White has better pawn structure, and white should have options to win here. So white's better by about 4 pawns. Makes sense. Okay, f3, sure. But there actually was a winning tactical opportunity for black here. It was on rook to d2, then bishop to a5, and this hangs back either an exchange or a piece. Probably best here is knight to b1, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2. But overall, another piece hanging error. So with those two things, in mind, tactics training I recommend to everybody. Please do it. But yeah, d6, d4, knight takes, pawn takes, knight to c3, bishop to e7, bishop to e2, castles, and basically here white has options. Castles, knight to c5, knight to f3, and this is this should be better for white. This is an option. Basically d6 is going to provide a lasting point of weakness for black. White's going to play things like bishop to f4, and queen to d2, rook to d1, and basically threats on d6 are going to be big for white. e5, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, and white's situation is fine. Bishop to f4, and then this knight to h5. So I don't really even want to look at this too much after knight takes h5. It's just really basically a tactically inefficient play. Let's look at this opening. Basically Philidor opening. Okay. Knight f3, d6, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, and in this situation, white is white's up by about 0.3. Okay, knight to f6, knight to c3, defending this this pawn on e4. Bishop e7, bishop e2. White's again up by about 0.4 pawns. Threats on d6, bishop f4 can play against d6. e5, knight takes, bishop to e6. And white's comfortable. I guess you can play bishop to f4, you can play bishop to g5, but yeah, this overall situation for white this basically is better for white. White has this knight outposted. I don't know. It's better. Not winning, but white has better chances. So basically, I don't think there's much of a there's not much to improve here. I think that there become large tactical errors, but you basically play opening correctly until your opponent hangs a piece. That's kind of an ideal way to win. You've played the opening theory correctly. Your opponent hangs a piece on h5. Yeah, that's not particularly. There's nothing really to improve in that game if you think about it. You played the opening correctly. Your opponent slips up and hangs a piece. So that's sort of it. Thank you for sending the game mat up. Really appreciate it. As always. Please feel free to send as many as you like. But the main thing I would recommend at your level is just really focus on tactical study. Tactical study involving, puzzles for 1 to 2 hours a day. For puzzles for 1 to 2 hours a day for a month, it'll really help. And then you can what there's in terms of looking at this game, we sort of know what both sides sort of needed to do to improve. This opening was fine, and everything was cool here. And then the knight gets hung on h5. So when you're trying to do analysis of the game, like, what could have been done better? Like, black could have not hung the knight. Eventually, with enough tactical study, you stop playing moves like knight to h5. You always see them when they're played, and then eventually neither opponent ends up doing moves like that. And you end up in a situation where where you win basically off of things that are not that. So that's kind of what I'd focus on. Really making sure that your tactical game is strong, and you bring yourself to a level where tactics are more of a tactics are seen more cleanly. And then once you're there, you have games that are sort of in many ways less sort of clear to analyze. It's just very clear what the error is here, right? You're going from a point where there's 0.23 advantage for white. White's played the opening reasonably. Black's played the opening reasonably, to a situation where white's up by 6 points. And with white up 6 points, white's much better. So, anyways, bishop takes h6, h5, and white should be good to go. One other demonstration is just it's just tactics. I mean, this game is 100% determined on tactics, and I don't, this is a good demonstration. I mean, you just need your tactics to be up to as high a level as possible. And with your tactics up to as high a level as possible, your level of play will improve pretty clearly. Rook to d2 also allows an interesting tactic here, just so we see it. Bishop to a5 with facing off against this knight on c3 and facing off against this rook on d2. That is better for black than what was played. This wins at least in exchange, so keep that in mind. And that is big there. Bishop to a5 facing off c3 and rook to d2, much better for black. Anyways, interesting stuff, interesting situations, and thank you very much for sending that game, Matyop. Really appreciate it. And tactics study. That's your next step. I hope this is helpful. But again, the next improvement that you have to do is really all on your side. It needs to be puzzle study. It needs to be like a significant amount of puzzle study for a significant amount of time. And if you do that, I think it'll really help. Your game will really improve, and I strongly recommend it. Okay, cool. Let's look. Next game, final game of today, or final game of this morning, sorry. This game is SWWI's game. Knight to c3, knight to c6. Okay, so we're looking at the Vienna game. So in the Vienna game, most common is knight to f6, knight to f6, knight to c6, by far the two most common options. Knight to c6, bishop to c4. This is the Max Lang defense, okay? Basically Max Lang defense with bishop to c4, sure. They're calling this the Bishop's Opening Vienna hybrid variation. I'm always interested in seeing how these transpose. The naming scheme on chess.com I think is great. One of my favorite things, actually. Sites for puzzles. Chess.com Puzzle Battle, Chess.com Puzzle Rush. Lichess has Puzzle Storm and Puzzle Racer. ChessTempo.com has a great free tactics trainer. And then there's a great tactics trainer with modular tactics, like so Lichess Puzzle Rush, Lichess Puzzle Storm, Lichess Puzzle Racer, I think are the two. I honestly I have a membership to chess.com, luckily enough, so I mostly know chess.com. But yeah, Lichess has their two tactics trainers. ChessTempo.com is great, and there's a program called CT-ART. Tactical masters are great to learn tactics. If you can see, Tal's games, I'm sure they have some really cool tactics in there. Any really high-level GM does some really interesting tactics. We were looking at a Carlsen game where there was, the only thing I would say is that, the very highest level GM tactics can be underwhelming in terms of what they actually gain. We were looking at some, sure, context is good. You can kind of see the types of tactics that stem out of specific openings. But again, I think, yeah, the efficiency is really, I guess I would say I'm very biased towards tactics trainers as an overall concept. You know, if you can see 600 tactics in an hour on Puzzle Battle, like if you do that for enough hours, you're going to see a lot of stuff really quickly, and your pattern recognition is really going to improve. You know, there are particular thematic tactics you can get from games, but yeah, I think that the real big tactics, you know, the real way to improve there is you know, through tactics training on a trainer. CT-ART is a great modular tactics training program, and then also ChessBase has some very good tactics training modules that you can bring in. But anyways, all of this is really interesting, yeah, I think you know, up until the point you're about 2,000, just improving your tactics will bring you some tremendous mileage. Okay, knight to f6, d3, bishop's opening, Vienna hybrid variation. Let's think about this. Knight to a5, most popular is black. Bishop to b4, second most popular is black. Hey, welcome, Pravila. Thanks for joining the stream. Thanks for being here. Bishop to b4, bishop to d2, castles, a3, bishop takes, and yeah. This is interesting. d6 was the most popular. But yeah, in this situation, we're in opening theory here. White has a slight initiative. Knight to e2 is given as better than bishop to d2. I think they're both fine. Knight to f3 is given as better than bishop to d2 here. I guess what the engine's sort of indicating here is that giving up your bishop pair is not too bad. Black has already given up his bishop pair, so if you trade into a bishop, you know, basically bishop versus bishop endgame. So here, you know, knight to e2 or knight to f3. These types of moves, you know, will develop your piece in a straightforward way, and the engine's basically arguing that knight takes c3 isn't that helpful for black. Bishop to d2, bishop to a2, rook to e8, queen to e2, yeah, black is basically up by a good amount here. White's pieces are kind of, you know, white has a spatial disadvantage and is kind of uncoordinated here. So yeah, this didn't really work out too well for black. White ends up in a winning endgame, and yeah, cool. So bishop to d2, not as good as knight to e2 here. So with bishop takes d2 and knight takes d5, knight to e2 is better. Bishop to a2, rook to e8, queen to e2, knight to d4, and basically queen to e2 is an error. Putting your queen on this file, or putting the queen on e2 on an open file against the rook. Yeah, you know, those happen to Pravilo. How's the tactical study going, Pravilo? I saw your rating went over 1,000. How are the tactics? So yeah, queen to e2, knight to d4, queen to d1, and basically this is sort of not that good for basically not that good for white. So queen to e2 is just too easily countered. So in terms of improving this game for white, I think this opening is all fine. Vienna hybrid variation, whatever. Bishop to d2 is an inefficiency. So in terms of changing and improving this game, bishop to d2 is an inefficiency. Instead, knight to e2, and you should be, you know, comfortable. But knight takes c3 isn't something that you should be worried about, and it's not something that you should be worried about to the point where you're willing to waste a move on bishop to d2. Bishop to d2 also just constrains your development further. White's not seeing fantastic development in this game. You know, this bishop is good, I guess, but so far White has really only developed his bishops, and particularly the c3 bishop facing off against e5 isn't particularly good. I think better for White here, knight to e2. But yeah, I would go with knight to e2 over bishop to d2 for sure. Knight to b6, bishop to a2, rook to e8, and then queen e2 is a simple. So we've already had one error, which is basically bishop to d2 is not an efficient enough move. But queen to e2, knight to d4, and queen to d1, and basically black's up by 4 points here. This knight got posted with tempo. Now it's black's opportunity to move. Basically e4 will open up the e file for this rook facing off against the king on e1, and that's big for black. With e4 here, this is going to be a very successful attack on the white king on e1. So that was it. Bishop to e6, bishop takes, knight takes e6, and yeah, this is good for white, I think. So yeah, now white's just a little better here. Let's look at this rook and pawn endgame too, just because it's kind of interesting. How does white get that pawn up? And this is way too much volatility, by the way. This shift of 4 in an king and pawn endgame position is going to be decisive in most cases. Yeah, that tactic seemed to play out pretty well for white. Yeah, but not as good as puzzle training. Just Puzzle Rush, Puzzle Battle, and Lichess puzzle trainers. My advice is just do it. Basically, those types of puzzles for an extended period of time, they're going to be the most helpful way that you can improve Pravilo. With those puzzles, that is your clearest. Just basically do them for a long enough period of time, Pravilo. I really think it will help. I really think it's like my goal is to have everyone improve as quickly as possible. So that is the way to do it. And there are plenty of free resources available to train on puzzles. Lichess puzzle training. So I think if you're worried about calculation as opposed to pattern recognition, go for slower puzzles. Chess tempo is where I would be at for that. But yeah, all of that kind of stuff. Just spend lots and lots of time doing it. It will be your quickest way to improve Pravilo. So yeah, e4, e5, knight c3, and all of this, all of this is fine for white. The big error for white was in wasting a move with knight bishop to d2. Just let the knight take on c3, much better. Bishop to d2 wastes your time. Queen to e2 runs into knight d4 immediately. Better was like, I don't know, knight to e2 was fine, knight to e2 and then castles. But playing a move knowing that your opponent will be able to advance with a move that will basically undo your move and give them tempo. This just overall the concept of this this kind of center exchange is something that white needs to really think about. So queen goes to e2, knight goes to d4, queen goes to d1, and basically here this is this is better for white. White ends up better, or basically black ends up better as a result of this. Just conceptually, this is just something that you don't want to do. Like, you don't want to play a move that brings your opponent's piece forward with the threat and then has you move immediately back to where you were previously. This should be kind of a good understanding of how tempo works. Like, queen e2 basically allows the knight to play d4 for free. And then once the queen moves back to exactly where it was, black gets another move. So at the beginning of all this, at the beginning of move 11, it's white's move, and the queen is on d1, and this is what the position looks like for white. At the end of move 12, the position is still exactly the same for white. Basically, no piece has moved, but black has gotten 2 pieces out for no cost at all. So this, basically having these 2 pieces out against this white static basically static white structure, this ends up being better for white. So that was really the solution there. If the queen goes to e2, then knight to d4, and things are basically fine. So castles, knight takes f3, queen takes f3, e4. Queen to g3, queen takes. overall here, white ends up in an okay situation, but just this route of giving your queen, you know, basically moving your queen somewhere, having to move it immediately back and giving your opponent 2 free tempos, not a good idea. Those two are errors, bishop to d2 and queen to e2. This ends up trading on into a roughly equal rook and pawn endgame. There's multiple errors here. After a4, this rook can play to h5 and basically win a pawn. I think, right? Yeah. So rook. So let's look at this tactic. Rook to h5 is a good move for black. Rook to h5, and then either white plays h3, in which case black plays rook h4 and skewers the a4 pawn. G4 is probably the best move for white here. If G4, then rook takes H3. Best move for white is king to F3. So with this, the rook can play to A4. This is kind of a cool tactic. Just so we're looking at endgame tactics, this is a pretty efficient way to do it. What we've seen basically in rook and pawn endgames is that making threats has a huge value. If you can make successful threats, they very frequently, push your position forward. So black basically gets to play 2 threats in sequence. First, he gets to play rook to h5, threatening on h2. Then, if basically white deals with this threat, either with rook to h1 or h3, then black gets to play rook h4 and skewer the pawn on a4. So rook to h5 threatens h3 first with tempo, and then rook to h4 skewers this king on and a4 pawn. So, anyways, interesting situation, and basically that would have provided a very good opportunity for black to get ahead in this endgame. From here, there's multiple tactical errors. G5 is a blunder because after G5, pawn takes G5, pawn takes G5, H5. This is going to be very difficult for black to deal with. Black has a connected passed pawn here, and white can't really hold it particularly well. So that's a big thing to consider. Overall here, just looking at this game so front to back, where were the improvements? Bishop takes c3, d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5. Fine. It does teach simple plans and so here I guess I would say knight to e2, knight to f3, bishop to d2 is worse than knight to e2 or knight to f3 here. So bishop d2 better for black. Knight to f3, knight to e2 would have been better. Bishop to a2, rook to e8, queen to e2. Queen to e2, knight to d4, queen to d1, bishop to e6. This whole trade allowed white to get or black to get very quick development against that queen on e2. Knight to f3, knight to d4. So there's basically 2 errors so far. Bishop to d2 was inefficient, and queen to e2 was immediately refuted by knight to d4. Knight to f3, and basically white is fine. And now we're in a rook and pawn endgame. Basically an early endgame. White seems to be pushing for an early endgame. That, it makes, I don't know, it's an efficient use of resources to go for an early endgame, but king to e6, g4, this king to e6 was an error. Rook to h5, facing off against h2, rook to h5, going for this play of h4. This was a great way to make 2 immediate threats and win a pawn. Rook to h5 threatens rook to h4 and threatens h2, and then if white plays anything to try to block this skewer, it's going to lose at least 1 pawn somewhere. So this is not what happened in the game. Instead, king to e6 was played, g4, rook goes for this threat, this fork, but white has a defensive resource. Pawn takes, h6, f6, and white is fine here, but g5, which allows this h5 to be played, creating a connected passed pawn. So g5 allows pawn takes, h5, connected passed pawn. This ends up being winning for black. So white didn't need to play so prematurely here. Much better for white was e4, then g5, then h takes g5. On h takes g5, then you basically play king e3 and wait for pawn takes e4. These three pawns face off, kind of consistently against each other. If e4, pawn takes, f takes e5, or f takes g5, then king to f3, and basically you're playing again for e3. But holding back this g5 move, this g5 creates this pawn, connected pass pawn for black, which should be enough to really get close to a win. So this was a big error for white, worth really knowing for your king and pawn endgames, to be completely honest. F6, g5, and black gets a connected pass pawn on h5. F takes, h5. Cool. So pawn takes, and now basically white wins using basically he has two pass pawns, but he can quickly get defense on this e4 pawn and win the endgame there. So from white's perspective, three main errors in this game. Let's go over them in order. Now we know this game pretty well, so we can kind of see. Bishop takes, d5, pawn takes d5, knight takes d5. Not worth playing bishop to d2. This knight is posted. This is a relatively strong knight. Letting it be played for knight takes c3 is actually fine. You can play knight e2 and then knight takes c3. So let's see knight e2 and then knight takes c3 here. Knight takes c3, even leaves you with undoubled pawns. Good pawn structure for white. So if this is a better route. Don't spend tempo, especially when you're already in a worse place. Especially when you're already in a worse place developmentally, you can play bishop to d2. But yeah, now you're in kind of a rough situation as white. Bishop takes, knight takes, and this, I don't know. This basically trades off into a very early endgame. I'm wondering if white could have done better by not trading off his bishop. Maybe playing like b3 here or c3. I don't know. But here it's an equal endgame. And then just the third really key error for white in this endgame is this endgame play, g5. You don't like white's inactive rooks. Let's think about that for a second. Yeah, so white has multiple developmental problems here. From this point, white is down by 3.3 pawns. So here, basically, white has kind of limited, white has limited his chances. This knight on d4 is facing off against this queen on e2. And, this is just overall worse for, this is overall just worse for white. Queen to d1, bishop to e6, bishop takes, knight takes. And, white has just poor development overall, if you think about it. Queen to e2, knight to d4, queen to d1, bishop takes, knight to f3. There just wasn't much. To do. Knight takes, queen to g3. Yeah, white never really had much of a coherent plan. Yeah. But yeah, this move I want to focus on, because knight to d4 just refutes it. Better for white here, knight to f3, knight to e2, straightforward developing moves. Bishop takes, knight to f3. And yeah. Yep, no, you're absolutely right, Lauren. Anyways, this is a rough situation, and c3. I don't know. Again, I don't want to be too negative about it, but bishop to d2, bishop to a2, rook to e8. Yeah, this is the error. Knight to e2, knight to f3. I don't know. But the third and final error here, what really decided, or basically, this ends up being kind of an interesting endgame. But what's really a bad error for white in this king and pawn endgame is g5. G5, it's like the type of thing, I think it's really worth looking at this position for a minute or two. But g5 allows black to get basically a connected passed pawn. So this was really so this we were looking at. This is basically the third error in this game. Luckily enough, black doesn't see it. This pawn structure is much worse than f takes, f takes, h5. That will end up being better for black. But yeah, that was g5 is an error, and after f takes h5. So yeah. Anyways, it happens. g5, h5, f takes, king takes. Playing your 2 pawns into your opponent's 3 pawns is just not a wise idea. Anyways, better for white, e4. E4, and you get basically, you pass a pawn on the e file to face off against these 3 pawns versus 2. I think just leaving things in the center here. Let's look at one of the engine plans. e4, g5, h takes, king f3, and basically neither side can really successfully advance this. Pawn takes e4 should be good for white, but yeah, let's go through and actually play it out. b6. It's funny. The engine seems to really be mishandling some of these endgames. It's weird. Yep, I think I think Lauren's talking about exactly the right principle there. It is rough with that king. With that king there, running those 2 pawns into 3 pawns is never going to be a worthwhile idea. So yeah, g5 is an error. Yep. Yeah, the invasion path is really the important part of this endgame. Anyways, really interesting situation. But that was a decisive. Basically that could have potentially been a really bad problem for white to have created for themselves. Luckily enough, it got missed. But yeah, no. I think you're right, Lauren. I think that is there are probably situations where you have a well-marked invasion path, but this actually wasn't one of them. So overall, we'll finish. We'll analyze front to back and then wrap up. This knight to e2, knight to f3 were better than knight takes e4 here, or sorry, we're better than bishop to d2 here. Bishop to d2 just isn't worth it in terms of time. If you're forcing a knight that's played twice, and basically tempo has been played to establish this knight on d5. So spending tempo to another tempo to take the bishop on c3, a bishop which isn't really doing much for you on this diagonal anyways, is not a bad thing for white. Not worth saving the bishop here. Just develop as white, keep your position moving forward, and aim for a more development-focused situation. Queen to e2 also immediately refuted by knight to d4. So 2 really big positional things, 2 really big positional takeaways for SWWI there. And I think that I'm hoping that those are kind of helpful to look at. Queen takes, and then queen takes, pawn takes, bishop to e3, and now we've got kind of a situation where I guess I would say that we're about equal and heading quickly into an early endgame, and then the endgame's pretty much equal. Everything's fine. And white fortunately makes an error that's missed by black of g5. So 3 improvements for white. Overall, great job. Great job winning this game at the end of the day. This manner worked out really well. H5 was a big error by black, big error shift of about 9 points in this game. Moving the pawn away from the defense of the king, not a good idea. Yeah, basically white ends up winning this cleanly. So h5 also is worth noting as kind of a very large king and pawn endgame is king and pawn endgame error for black. So g5, pawn takes g5, king g6, and yeah, after h5, which basically takes this pawn away from the defense of the king, white is much better. So anyways, thank you all very much for watching. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm gonna need to kind of go after the people whose games were last night, because I did them a little bit out of order here. But yeah, thanks very much for being here. Thanks very much for joining the stream. And yeah, 6 good game analysis. Very interesting. Next stream tonight is basically it's going to be another normal one of 3 lesson and 3 analysis. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks all very much for being here and enjoying the lesson. And yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Next lesson is at 9:35 p.m. Eastern time tonight in about 12 hours. So thank you very much for being here. Hope to see you tonight and have a good night. Thanks a lot. See you later. Have a good day. Bye.